Well, I just want to say one thing. People talk about the hawkish Fed and the hawkish ECB and central banks and so forth. We have to look at this matter in the perspective from a longer term point of view, because today we have a generation of people who grew up amidst artificially low interest rates that were distorting economic life. In other words, you had in Europe, you had negative interest rates, okay? Negative interest rates is a kind of a absurdity that arose out of the so-called modern monetary theory and so forth, which is not modern at all, because it was already used, the example of negative interest rates in the 1920s by a German-Swiss economist called, the name will come back to me, Gesell. His name was Silvio Gesell. You can look it up on the internet. Anyway, he advocated negative interest rates as a way to penalize people with money, in other words, people who had deposits. And also it became kind of a Keynesian view that in order to stimulate demand, you could sort of introduce artificial low interest rates, which then penalizes people to have large deposits in the banking system. In other words, you discourage savings, period. And in Europe, we had since 2011, up to last year, actually up to this year, negative interest rates. This is criminal in my opinion, because it led to a lot of inflationary symptoms like asset inflation. And in the US, we had next to zero interest rates since 2011 and massive money printing. And this then kept interest rates artificially low for far too long. And when inflation began to manifest itself, long before Ukraine, you know, the central banker says, they all say, oh, it's the war where interest rates increasing and inflation is increasing. Began long before that. In any event, the adjustment recently is in terms of percentage increase huge. The 10-year Treasury note went from 0.57% in May 2020 to now over 4%. A huge increase, I mean, percentage-wise, in a short period of time. But when you talk about hawkish, you're saying interest rates on the Fed fund rate at 4% is hawkish when inflation is at 9%? You must be joking. Interest rates should be at 9.5%, 10%. In 1969, when inflation had begun to rise in the late 60s, the 10-year Treasury note was over 9%. It then dropped to a yield of about 3.7%. And then in 73, 74, it went up, the 10 years Treasury note, to over 12%. But inflation was not higher than it is today, okay? And in Europe, this criminal called Lagarde, she's in charge of the ECB. Why she's in charge, nobody knows, because she has no clue about monetary matters, but she was put there by some people behind the scene. So anyway, she's there, and until a year ago, she said, oh, inflation, it's not a problem, it's temporary. And now she has interest rates at 0.75%, when inflation in the EU is over 9%. And you tell me they're hawkish? No, they're not hawkish. They're incompetent. Criminal. A criminal is someone who steals money. The central banks have stolen money from honest people who had their money on deposit, Because if inflation is 9% and your deposit rate is say 4%, you still lose 5% per annum.